Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this very first lecture of our class, which has to do with a very introductory topic when it comes to U.S. history. And that topic, to put it real simply, is why is it that Western Europeans got to a point where travel by maritime routes, by ship, was something that they did not do really en masse, except for a couple of small cultures. And then all of a sudden, right around the 1450s, there was an explosion of maritime technology and development and finally of exploration. How did we get to that point? And that's what leads to this whole contact issue of Western European explorers and conquerors and settlers making their way over to the North and South American territory. And so that's kind of the beginning. That's always how we like to start out, is to give that. And then in your textbook reading, you'll be looking at indigenous societies and what they were up to and how they reacted to uh, this sudden explosion of Europeans upon their territory, people that they had never even really heard of before, and suddenly they're all just there. What happened? And so we're looking at this very early period. When it comes to history, everything connects to something else, even going back sometimes more than 1,000 years. And so we look here at a date range that I have for you on this one slide, right around 1100 to 1588. And that's a range of which we're talking about with this first lecture and even with part two, which is also this week. And so the title is kind of crazy: How the Crusades Triggered the Age of Exploration and the European Settlement of America. The Crusades are hundreds of years before the Age of Exploration, roughly 400 years if you look at the First Crusade. So how do we make that connection? And it's really kind of simple. If I were to turn this lecture into just a few moments and I had to answer it quickly, I would say it has to do with trade and the motivations for increasing trade. It's always about trade when it comes to people developing a huge amount of technology to move around the world, and to do so isn't just because they want to explore. To do so isn't just because they want to build things. To do so means that they also want to make money from it almost every time, and that results in trade. That's just always the one common denominator. So, what that leads us to is a really quick background of something that is even today in some places still known as the Silk Road. The Silk Road, if you happen to have any classes on history, like ancient history and medieval history or Western Civ, world history, you may have heard of the Silk Road. And the Silk Road is this series of trade routes that connected parts of Asia to parts of Europe and parts of Africa. And it's maritime trade routes, it's land-based trade routes, it's just a lot of trade routes. And when they call it the Silk Road, obviously that means that silks traveled on it, from parts of China, for instance, and India. But that doesn't mean that that's all that was traded. There was lots of material traded upon these usually protected roads that connected continents in some cases together. And so let me just show you this real simplistic view of the Silk Road. Europe was involved in the early Silk Road, even as far back as the Greeks, but especially when we get to the Romans. The Romans are going to have a fairly long lasting civilization, and that civilization allows enough time for the Romans from their republic days all the way into their empire days to actually get involved in hundreds of years of trade along the Silk Road. And we have stories of Romans actually traveling from way over here out of Italy, going all the way in towards the courts of Han, China, and coming back, making different inroads upon thousands of miles of the Silk Roads, right? And again, there's also, if you look at other maps, there's maritime routes that all connect up to these main roads as well. So if we look at Western Europe, way over here, when we talk about what will one day become the Spanish and the Portuguese and the English and the Dutch and the Germans and the Italians, these are really a lot of different cultures and ethnicities that live over here that are all either under or affected by the rule of Rome during the ancient period in this whole Mediterranean region. And if they're going to get something out of the Silk Road, it's because Rome and Rome's legions and Rome's government has helped to make that happen. And so the Silk Road is a big part of of Roman expansion over time, especially in this eastern part of the Roman Empire. We'll be talking a lot about this as we go on. Right here, this little golden spot where I have my little fake pointer right here, this little red dot, you'll notice that there's this ocean here. This is called the Black Sea. And over here is the Mediterranean Sea. And then down here is the Persian Gulf. And one of the biggest cities that Rome is going to develop, the Roman Empire phase, is going to develop that helps to control trade between the Silk Road on this side and its territories, Roman territories of Western Europe and North Africa, is through a city that's going to be built here eventually called Constantinople. And that city is still there, although it's known as Istanbul today, and it's still quite important as a gateway of maritime trade between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. And we'll talk more about this. I just wanted to draw your attention geographically to Italy, where Rome is, to here, where a city called Constantinople is, a Roman city. So Rome and Constantinople, both Roman. And then this idea of there being a Silk Road that connects all these peoples together at a time when everybody that lived in this region thought that this was the entire world, right? That there's nothing else there. That this is what they know. So why does that matter? How does that relate to U.S. history in any way? Well, that gets us to the point of what happens when Western Europeans want to get more involved in this Silk Road. How do they do it? What happens when Western Europeans are cut off from the Silk Road? And how do Western Europeans eventually try to get back into trade with the Silk Road? All of this relates to how we get to settlement of Western Europeans in droves over in North and South America, believe it or not. So I want to show you this. These are trade routes of the Silk Road as we go into the post-Roman Empire phase. You'll notice cities here like Antwerp and Genoa and Venice and Lisbon, right? And these are major maritime trading zones that have some trade, not a ton, but some trade coming in. And you'll notice that there's one area of trade that's coming into Western Europe, coming from Jerusalem and Damascus, and another area where it's all going to Constantinople. When is this? Well, we're looking at trade right around 1300 Common Era. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Common Era is what we now call AD. So AD, Anno Domini, is kind of how you said after zero of the modern age, and that's something that was used a lot in the past. But now the scholars of the world tend to use CE. So when I say CE, I mean Common Era, meaning modern era after ancient period of leading from BC up into zero. I just wanted to be clear in case anybody was not used to hearing CE for something. So CE, Common Era. So by 1300, look at the trade routes. They're still coming in to Western Europe, and obviously, although it's 1300 Common Era, the Roman Empire as an empire of the Mediterranean and of North Africa and of Western Europe had ceased to exist by right around 410. It's kind of the big date of the collapse of the actual city of Rome itself. And so the Roman Empire had been in decline for quite a while in the modern era. So some years before this, 600 years before this, the Roman Empire was basically gone as far as a government, and all that remained was little groups of Roman culture in certain cities, and of course religion. Christianity had picked up towards the end of the Roman Empire phase, and now Roman culture was largely governed through that, or spread through that, the Roman Catholic Church right here in Rome. So what we have then are lots, by the time we get to 1300, lots of different cities of lots of different little kingdoms, Western European kingdoms that are running their countries right here. And some of these kingdoms have direct trade with the East, and some of them don't. And what I want to connect real quick is how we have direct trade coming into these cities in 1300, even though the Roman Empire itself is gone. How did that happen? How did Western Europe get access to this trade? One other thing I want to bring into play here is this hashtags, all these marks, these diagonal marks across the screen. What is this all about? And what I want to tell you here it is right here, the Islamic world. Right around 630 CE, there was a new faith that was born right over here in where modern day Saudi Arabia is. And right along the Persian Gulf, right here, Mecca and Medina, there is a new religion that starts up called Islam. And that religion starts in a very small area here, and then it expands. And by the time we get to 800 Common Era, there's an empire. There's a huge Islamic empire right here. And that's what this is. So when we look at 800 Common Era, this region right here is Christian, Roman Catholic for the most part, and a little bit of Greek Orthodox right here. We'll talk more about these guys in a minute. But this is Western Christian Europe. And everything else right here, massive, very profitable trading empire that has taken over about 60% of the Silk Road as it still exists. And it's this Islamic empire. And there's two places where the Islamic empire is washing into Christian Europe of 600 through 800. And that's right here in the Spanish Peninsula. As from Morocco, you've got Muslim armies and cultures invading here. And then on this side, coming up towards Constantinople, which is still a Roman city. It's still what's left of the Roman Empire. Constantinople is a Christian medieval European city, and it's the very eastern border of Christendom, whereas the Spanish Peninsula is the very western border when it comes to contact with Muslims of the Western European kingdom. And really, all that has to happen here is this Islamic empire that has spread so far can just keep going. There's so many people involved in this, and in theory, it could just break through at some point, and from Constantinople and break through from here into Spain. And at some point, you could see, in theory, a Muslim Europe. It's just that's not going to happen, largely because the power of Constantinople is vast. They're very powerful, very strong, and on its own for a long time, the Byzantines, as we would call them, if you're a history nerd of the period. The Eastern Romans, the medieval culture known as the Byzantines here in Constantinople, are powerful enough that they're able to fight and win against Islamic armies that do come up to try to enter into Western Europe, or the eastern border of Western Europe. And then right here, you have a combination of fighting between powerful names in both France and Spain that managed to slow down Muslim armies that invade, to the point where all that's left of Spain, we'll talk more about this later, is going to be right here. And the rest of this is all going to be ruled by this Muslim empire by the time we get to 1000. So the point is that slowly, very slowly, Christian Europe is starting to erode away as the Muslim empire becomes ever more powerful, largely due to the fact that it's sitting right on top of the Silk Road and is a fairly new cohesive empire that's uniting a lot of different cultures together. And so how does Western Europe get involved in this? How does this matter? What does this mean? Well, let's connect this part, the ancient Roman Silk Road, to Europe being involved in the Silk Road, and then fit this Muslim empire, this relatively new Muslim empire, into the story. How does all this come together? What does that mean for Western Europe, and how does that lead to the Age of Exploration? Well, here's that snapshot. Let me take my little laser pointer right here, Constantinople. Okay, let's look at that closer. Right here, Constantinople. When we get to about 1000 Common Era, this little bastion of what was left of the Roman Empire after the entire Roman Empire collapsed, this is what's left of right here. And they stopped calling themselves the Romans for a long time. They were instead calling themselves the Byzantine. And so you've got the city right here, Constantinople, named after an emperor once known as Constantine. And this little Byzantine Empire right here, main language was actually Greek. All right, so very kind of Eastern Roman Greek-speaking group of people who carried on a number of the traditions of the ancient Roman Empire, because it was in this kind of medieval period that these guys still exist, and they've got a powerful army, a powerful navy, good technology, and they're able to fight against the growing, fairly new Muslim empire that's coming around this way. By the time we get to about 1040 to 1050, we actually have some major battles where these guys here, the Byzantines, these Eastern Romans, who do things on their own, they're in control of a lot of trade that comes through Constantinople on the Silk Road. And to be true about it, If you're in Western Europe and you want items from the East or you want to sell items to the East, most of the time you had to go through Constantinople to do it. So Constantinople was this gateway of trade between the East and the West, and they knew it, and it made them really rich. Well, the deal is that these guys are starting to lose some major battles. One of them is known as Manzikert, if you get into this stuff, in the 11th century. They're losing some major battles because, honestly, the government of the Byzantine Empire is starting to erode, it's starting to fall apart. You've got a lot of different groups that are vying for power against the Byzantines over here, especially in Venice and Genoa. And then over here, you've got the Muslims getting ever more powerful through their Abbasid Empire. And the end result is that these guys are basically surrounded by people that don't really like them much. And so slowly but surely, they're starting to fall apart. The deal is that I always find very interesting is that although these are Christians, these are very powerful, once Roman, now medieval Christian Byzantines, very powerful. Although they're Christians, they're not the same Christian as these guys are over here. These are Roman Catholic Christians run through the Roman Catholic Church, and these are what today we would call Greek Orthodox Christians. And they see Christianity somewhat differently. And the deal is that these guys kind of view most of the folks that live over here as in Western Europe as being barbarians. You know, they're no longer purebred Romans, and they're mixed with a whole lot of different tribal groups that helped to conquer, in some cases, the Roman Empire. And for the most part, these guys see themselves as basically the last bastion of civilization in Europe, and they turn a very, very stuffy nose up at most of Western Europe. And so that tells you how crazy it gets when by about 1080, about 1080, the Byzantine Empire is actually going to look over at Western Christendom. Let me go to the big map again. So Western Christendom, the Byzantine Empire, these guys who are in charge of all this trade and very powerful old Roman culture, is under attack, especially from the Islamic armies moving into Eastern Europe. And Constantinople / the Byzantines are actually going to ask for help from the other Christians that they consider to be basically a bunch of mongrel barbarians. And they do. And that's what starts the First Crusade. So right here in Rome, Pope Urban II, he is going to get the letter from the Emperor of Constantinople, and Pope Urban II is going to declare the first ever European crusade, a Christian crusade against Muslim people. And that's going to be an interesting move. And you might ask why? Well, the reason why is not just about religion. Religion is almost always a justification as opposed to the actual reason for something happening when it comes to, say, warfare. Usually there's a deeper reason for something happening. And that reason, ladies and gentlemen, is that, well, Constantinople controls so much trade. Go back up to this map, which is more accurate for this, controls all this trade from the Silk Road that comes into Western Europe. And there has not been an opportunity for the kingdoms of Western Europe of the Middle Ages to actually develop their own trade connections with the Silk Road, because Constantinople always blocks it. These Byzantines here, these Eastern Romans, always block it. They want control of all this trade coming into Western Europe from the Silk Road. So here we are in the very post-Roman period. It's the Middle Ages, and you've got a number of fairly powerful kingdoms coming out of Western Europe. England and the Kingdom of Leon, which will one day be Spain, and a number of separate German states, and of course France, and more. And they want access to direct trade without having to go through Constantinople. So how do they do it? Well, you can try to make deals, but Constantinople doesn't want you to, and they've got a big navy just always patrolling right over here, making sure that Western Europeans can never set out their own trade route with the Silk Road. So what happens is we get to 1080 and 1090, Common Era, AD, and the Byzantines are under attack from the Muslims of this empire. And so Constantinople says, can you guys help? Come on, if we fall, if we collapse, all of Western Europe is open to invasion from these Muslim armies. You got to help us. And so the Pope in Rome says, haha, that sounds like an invitation. and he's going to get most of the French and the English and some Germanic knights and soldiers to actually go attack. And why are they attacking? A, Christianity. B, because they can set up, finally, for the first time, without the people of Constantinople blocking them, can send Western European armies into here. Let me go to this map. Into here, right here, Jerusalem, and set up a direct trade route with the Silk Road between Western European kingdoms, especially England and France, between England and France and the Eastern Silk Road, without having to go through these dudes, Constantinople and the Byzantines. That's really the main reason why the First Crusade is going to be something that so many people get behind. Okay, it's sure it's a crusade, and there's promises of eternal salvation if you just get over there and kill some of the infidel and all those crazy things that come with it. But the main reason to do this, from the leadership aspect, Pope Urban II and the kings that lead their armies in, is because you get to finally go around Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire and allow Western Europeans to trade here. Well, now this is just a tiny part of the story. Here you have armies invading into the Holy Lands, as they will be known. And the results of all these crusades, you've got the First Crusade, Second Crusade, Third Crusade, Fourth Crusade, and then a number of personal crusades, okay, that actually happened here too. And not to get too deep into the crusades. I mean, that's its own story that has less to do with U.S. history than anything. That's more of a Western Civ story. So right here, these are all the routes taken by crusaders who have a lot of reasons now, both religion and, of course, profit, to go over here and attack the Muslims over here, okay? So what's going to happen is, through all these wars, these crusades, especially the first through the fourth, these crusades are going to result in a whole bunch of brand new trade routes between the kingdoms of Western Europe and the East. Okay, and Constantinople is ever getting weaker. The Byzantine Empire has now invited its own destruction, really, by allowing Western Europe to bypass Constantinople and to go into the East. Well, what's going to happen during this period? We have several hundred years here, okay? What's going to happen during this period? Well, first of all, I want to make it real clear that the population of Western Europe is going to start to grow. Why is that? Well, here it is. This is, in a nutshell, why. Because of all these medieval soldiers and aides and peasants and merchant class, middle class people, everybody going east to go fight in these wars, those that did, you're going to create a whole bunch of new economies run by these princes of Western Europe who are able to move trade from caravans on the ground and ships on the Mediterranean Ocean. And you're going to have all this new trade. And you've got technology where Western European nobles can build these kinds of fortifications, for instance, instead of these. How do they get the technology to do that? A lot of it was from the East. How about this? Transportation. How can you go to sea and trade if you don't know where you are when you go to sea? Medieval shipborne trade was often just sail along the shorelines of major lakes and the Mediterranean Ocean, for instance, and the Black Sea. These guys couldn't go into the open ocean. It was really hard for them to do that. Even the Vikings rarely went onto the open ocean. They did coastline sailing. And the deal is that right here in Astrolabe, this is kind of like a very rudimentary version of what could be considered a GPS. It's not even close to being accurate, but there's an idea of it. You use this and you can tell, to a certain extent, where you are, north and south upon the ocean. Over here, you've got a compass. These are tools that were very rare in Western Europe, but because of this trade right here, you're going to see more of these tools becoming available to people that want to get involved in trade with the Silk Road. There's money there, so being able to purchase stuff like this is really important if you're going to trade. What else? Gunpowder is going to make its roads and make huge changes throughout Western Europe over the next couple hundred years. And of course, the spices. What would culinary hearts be without all these spices? This could be a huge part of a trade coming from the east to the west. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, all of these. But what's really important right here, salt. This is a big deal, the salt. Salt is important because salt, it's not that salt didn't exist in Western Europe or anything like that. It's just that it was hard to get. There was not enough salt for all the people that wanted it. And there were times where there were even wars in early medieval history between different leaders in Europe over control of what small salt trade there was. Actual wars over salt. How crazy is that? Well, the deal is, guys, is that there was a lot of salt to be garnered from mines over here in North Africa along the African part of the Silk Road and over here in parts of the Near East. And so Western Europeans who are not fighting, but are the tradesmen that always follow the armies. These people set up their own deals with the Muslims here of these major territories and start trading salt along with the other technologies into Europe. And so much salt becomes available. Think about for a minute what salt is actually used for mostly. I know you can sometimes put it on fries and they're really good that way, right? But what salt is really used for is preservation. And when you go into the store and you pick up something that you want to eat, that's already pre-prepared for you in a can or a box or in a microwavable package, you look in the back and you'll see sodium, right? It's usually a pretty high number. Sodium, usually in the hundreds of milligrams. Sodium is salt, and salt is what keeps things from rotting too quickly. And so with salt, you're able to actually help people who can get a hold of salt. You're able to help people, peasants and middle class persons and nobles too, who want to have more food. You can grow plenty of food in Western Europe. It's just that it didn't last long enough. The winters were sometimes, especially up here, when you get to North Central Europe and further up here in Scandinavia, the winters can last anywhere from 5 to 8 months out of the year. So when you have your harvests, your food, your vegetables, your meat, the whole thing, it's not going to be able to last long enough to keep a lot of people alive, except for those that happen to be lucky enough to be where they can actually have fresh food coming in. And so the deal is that the population was always mitigated by bad nutrition and by a lack of food. It was just hard to get long lasting, good quality food. When salt starts to come in after about 1200 Common Era, you've got more and more people with access to food that they can store. And when you have more people with access to food that they can store, you've got more people who are going to be able to eat, which means you have more people who are going to live longer. Okay, so the life expectancy of a middle class to lower class person in a good portion of Western Europe during the early Middle Ages was somewhere in the range of old age by time you're 30, kind of thing, like dead within your 30s. Whereas when we get to the 1400s, your life expectancy is actually quite a bit higher. We're looking at 50s to 60s in general, and people even got older than that. And so that's kind of a big deal. It's just whenever a disease would go through, right, or a war, right, you're going to have some of the problems or some kind of natural calamity. It's just that overall, the average life expectancy after the Fourth Crusade is actually starting to grow rapidly in Western Europe, largely because of economy. People have jobs, trade, right, and of course, salt is just a huge part of it. Okay, I want to mention that during this time, these periods of crusade and exploration and gosh, what is over there in the east and the whole thing, you've got a couple of names that pop up. Marco Polo, who is famous from going from here in Venice and traveling all the way through this part of Asia and making his way back through India, back up this way. Everything that Marco Polo basically discovers and writes about is everything that Western Europe is going to know about Asia and India as we get into the Columbus era. He was the one main guy for a period of about 30 years who traveled around Asia and brought back a lot of stories. And he dies finally in, I think it was Venice that he actually died in when he was in his old age. But this is the era in which he traveled. Some of you have heard of a game that people like to play in pools and stuff. Marco Polo, kind of, where's Marco Polo? Marco Polo. Well, my wife and I like to play this one, Ibn Battuta. She yells Ibn and I yell Battuta when we've lost each other in the store or something. And Ibn Battuta was similar like this too. This is just another really interesting explorer. In this case, you've got a Roman Catholic, and in this case, you've got a Muslim explorer, and he travels throughout this massive region as well. So these two people here are these writers of books that inspire a lot of folks throughout this whole region to want to find out more about this wide world that only a couple of hundred years before nobody really knew much about, right? So we just to know that this has happened. Now we get here the trade routes that are growing as a result, and there's whole new trade empires here, entire families that are managing this trade, like the German Hanseatic League and all this stuff, right? This is all this trade that has come in the expanded Silk Road, major cities. You know, these cities have grown huge because the trade goes through those cities. Excuse me. Frankfurt, right? Paris, Orleans, Bordeaux, Brienne, right? You come up here, Edinburgh, York, Lincoln, London. These are all major cities that grow even bigger because the trade is going through here. This is all trade that was either a trickle or non-existent before the Crusades. Okay, it's just that this is all stuff coming from the east and also traveling to the east. And I wanted to mention this. There's such a population growth in Western Europe after 1200 that there's enough people around that actually can go to colleges. You know, wealthier people, wealthier middle class, merchant class people, and nobles who could actually go to schools, to colleges, which was very rare in the early Middle Ages. But as we get to the high Middle Ages of the late 12 to 1300s, guys, you've got colleges sprouting up all over the place. Here's the 13th century. By the 13th century, we've got Cambridge and Oxford, right? We've got over here the University of Paris. These are all colleges that exist, if it's this little diamond or this little square, by 1400. And then you get into the 1300s, and you've got even more, right? So this is a huge amount of growth, not only of knowledge for the wealthier classes, let's be clear, but also of trade that affects everybody. So this is all of this, including the exploration. It's all a result of crusades. These crusades that help to connect Western Europe to the Silk Road. Okay, well now what happens? Right? People want this trade. They like this trade. They get used to this trade, and then disaster strikes. That's right. On this very trade routes, the very trade routes. Tell me if this sounds familiar. There is going to be a disease that comes out of China, and this disease is called the Black Plague. And this Black Plague comes in on these trade routes. The Silk Road travels along the Silk Road and eventually makes its way by about 1348 into Western Europe. And this Black Death is going to kill over 30 million people within 10 years in Western Europe. Some imagery for you. You've got, if you've ever seen The Holy Grail with the that a movie by the Monty Python tribe where they have to bring out your dead cards, because there were these cities where there's so many people that died, there actually had to be a municipal body disposal service that would just come through with carts to load up the bodies to take them out to mass graves every day. Well, this is one of those in an actual period painting, because that was normal. That was normal, where you've got a situation where so many people are dying that you've got to have a body disposal service. Over here, of course, you've got your famous plague masks. These guys were these doctors and whatnot that would wear these masks with filters in them and stuff. Probably as effective, if not more effective, than what people are wearing outside for the COVID crisis. Over here, you've got imagery, right? Imagery of live people fleeing from the plague, which is considered to be death coming upon the world. Basically, this is a very, when you think about the tens of thousands of people in major cities and major kingdoms dying every year, to the point where you've got 30 million people dying in a decade, then you can think that probably the people of Europe felt like the end was nigh. Revelations had been achieved. The end of the world was here. And so there's lots of stories that people cooked up of death and death's minions coming in, the horsemen of the apocalypse to destroy humanity, right? You've got this here, the idea that there is nobody escapes the plague. Nobody escapes death. Doesn't matter if you're a pope or a king, right? Nobody escapes death. And so you've got a lot of these kind of viewpoints of of the world as well at the time. Everybody's going to die, right? And you've got death dancing about, capering about, dragging a woman and her newborn child into death with him. Became something that you actually see with comedy and whimsicalness because the plague was so common during the middle of the 1300s that you actually get this. People actually writing major stories and artwork and the whole thing about the plague being a major player in all of it. Huge cultural shift. And this should terrify you if anything ever does. Here's the growth after the Crusades starting in 1090. Here's the growth of the European population. And this is just in England. And this graph is very similar everywhere else in Western Europe. But this is just in England itself. Population growth by the millions, right? Growth, exponential growth. Big cities, the whole thing, starting up with the colleges and universities, right? And boom, a plague hits, and we have a drop, and then it rises back up, and then a major plague hits. And look at that. Look how many millions died just in England alone. Bam, right? And then we see further drops because the plague doesn't just come and go. Just COVID will be the same way. It's going to be epidemic after epidemic after epidemic for a while. And then finally, as we get into the middle of the 1500s, right, you've got the rising of population again. So that's what's going on here. This is amazing stuff. Well, between 1350 and 1450, something else happens as a result of the plague that's coming in on the Silk Road. The collapse of Eastern and Western trade. Why? Partially because you don't want to actually risk your life by trading along all this. It's a huge mess of death. So you're going to see major disruptions in trade because it's not just Western Europe that gets hurt by the plague. China, India, all the cultures along the Silk Road throughout Persia, North Africa, right? They're all suffering the same thing. Millions of them are dying too. So trade collapses, just gone, except for small trickles between various small cities and other small cities. So there's another problem, which is that there's a lot of warfare during this period as well. Between 1350 and 1450, there's a whole host of little wars between kingdoms who are fighting each other for resources. They can't get resources from the East-West trade, so now they're getting it from each other, often through warfare. One of those famous wars, of course, is the 100 Years' War, all right, between England and France, and that's something worth reading about. A lot of interesting things that happen there, but it's largely based on the plague coming and going, and England and France having their 100 Years' War in the middle of all that. And then finally, probably the most real impact when it comes to wars during the plague era, we've got Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire finally collapses. What was left of the ancient Roman Empire, this was it. Constantinople is captured by the Ottoman Muslim Turks in 1453, which is going to cut off largely West and East trade for a while. There you go, your Turkish armies, your Ottoman armies destroying the walls of Constantinople. Major battle, but Constantinople falls, which was impossible to beat by anybody before, but now it's done. Constantinople falls, and ladies and gentlemen, Western Europe has now been slapped right back into the Dark Ages. All right, Western Europe was growing successfully, trade routes. Really, the Renaissance has now begun. Especially in Italy, and the rest of Europe is starting to get something out of that. Culture is expanding, and knowledge. And then the plague comes and just slaps a huge part of Western Europe right back into the Dark Ages. And the Renaissance is right here in Venice and Genoa, and everybody else just kind of forgets about it. It's just not going to happen for a while. And so that leads us to, all right, that graph, every time I see it. All right, so leads us to this. All right, finally. One of the territories that did not suffer so badly during the Great Plague and the warfare and all that was Portugal. Portugal is right here. Portugal is surrounded by mountains, much like California is, and also some desert. Portugal has only a few major roads that go into it from Spain. Portugal is fairly well protected because of that. They can block off roads and defend those roads, and they can control refugees that might be bearing the plague or armies that might be coming in. And so Portugal is pretty safe. And so what that means is that there's this guy that shows up in the middle of the 1400s called Henry. And Henry, also known as the Navigator, also known as the King of Portugal, Henry is going to basically be the Jeff Bezos of Western Europe. He's going to develop an idea for reestablishing Western Europe's collapsed trade that has been gone for about 100 years now, but people want it back. They they want to revive the Silk Road trade with the East. They just can't figure out how to do it, and especially now that Constantinople is closed down to them. And so what happens is Prince Henry of Portugal is going to spend millions of dollars on developing, and again, he can do this because Portugal has largely survived, mostly unscathed by the warfare and by most of the plague. And Portugal, under Prince Henry, is going to spend millions of dollars to try to improve Western European maritime technology, ships. Why does he do it? Well, because it's quite obvious that going from Portugal to Asia and back is impossible through the old routes. The old Silk Road routes are just a mess. It's chaos. So he has this idea. Why not sail around Africa? Now, no European that we know of has ever done it for his time. So no one quite knew what was down here. There was nobody thinking that the world was flat. That was not the issue. We'll talk more about that in the next lecture. It's just that it seemed too far away. Okay, and there were lots of myths about what kinds of crazy sea monsters were down here and stuff. It was a very long trip for a medieval ship to go all the way around Africa. And so that's what he has to fix. He has to be the guy that creates a whole new trade route for products to move to and from Asia to Europe. And he wants it all to go right through him, just like Jeff Bezos and Amazon, right? And so what he's going to do is he's going to spend a ton of money on focusing his labor and his scientific efforts on taking a medieval cog, which was never designed. It's like a big overgrown boat. Was never designed to go into the open ocean, and to take a medieval cog and turn it into something that can go into the open ocean. I want to give you some images of a medieval cog. So right here from a medieval manuscript, you've got these basically these boats here, right? And there's a naval battle happening where these guys pull these things up alongside each other and fight. They got bows and stuff. This is a fight between, of course, France and England. You got over here another image of a cog, a forecastle and a stern castle, all right, that you would do for defense. All right, these are cogs. These are if you get into archaeology, maritime archaeology, these are built by shell first construction, which means you actually build the outside of the ship first, and then you put some strengthening beams inside, and that's it. And what that means is that these are very flexible boats. The problem is that means that if you take them into the open ocean, they will twist themselves into pieces. Okay, it's just not good. These are, again, they're designed to sail along coastlines and in big lakes and on rivers. That's it. That's all they're designed to do. So Prince Henry has that challenge. How do I get around Africa so I can reestablish the Silk Road that was created for us in the modern era by the Crusades, made a lot of Europeans very wealthy, and brought us into an early Renaissance, and then was smacked down by the bubonic plague and all the chaos that followed. How do I get back to the Silk Road? And his idea is, let's sail around Africa. How do you sail around Africa? You got to have better ships. So let me show you what he invents, what he and his family and his people invent. The caravel is a new type of vessel that is invented largely by the Portuguese. And it's going to be a vessel that's designed by building a frame first, a skeleton, if you will, and then you nail the planks to the outside. It's a whole big thing. And essentially, it's a very strong, rigid vessel. Okay? What's also interesting about it, if you look at the cog, you notice that if it has a mast and a sail, it only has one mast and one sail. And square sails are not great for all kinds of sailing. You need to have different shaped sails for different kinds of sailing needs. And so the caravel is a hybrid vessel. All right, it's the Prius of maritime sailing in the Middle Ages. You've got one mast, two masts, 3, 4, 5 masts on these things. All right, and they can carry square sails for long straight sailing where the wind is very stable, And they can switch out these sails at any time to these triangular, known as lateen sails, anytime they need to, when they need to switch to more variable winds that you would have along coastlines and in lakes and rivers and around mountains and stuff. And so the caravel becomes this very strong, rigid, deep water vessel that can carry people and cargoes into the open ocean. What does that mean? Well, the Portuguese, after spending enough money on this to launch a space shuttle, all right, these guys spend so much money. And to be honest with you, the Portuguese are basically doing what Kennedy and the aftermath of the Kennedy administration is going to do when trying to put a man on the moon, okay, with the space program with NASA. This is a big deal, and it's going to bring, with a lot of money and a lot of effort and a lot of people, is going to bring Portugal into a whole new era of maritime exploration. And it happens because of this, all right, the caravel. And so I want to show you what happens as a result. As a result of this, within 40 years of Prince Henry's death in the 1480s, you've got ships that you might recognize when you watch Pirates of the Caribbean movies and stuff. You've got much bigger vessels called carracks. A carrack is a very big caravel. Pinnaces and galleons. These are all vessels that are based upon the caravel right here. All vessels based on Prince Henry's ideas. And so what does that mean? Portugal is going to finally make its way around Africa and start trading with the Silk Road that still exists between India, for instance, and China. And so Portugal is going to become extremely wealthy very quickly. Let me show you this map to give you an idea of how far the Portuguese get in a 30-year period. Portugal, right here, has managed to make inroads where they've taken some territory in some cases or just claimed it as their own trade route all throughout Africa, throughout India, have made it to China. Portuguese ships have made it to China and the Philippines. And Portuguese ships sailing wider and wider because they can survive to explore, have also discovered this. They don't know what it is. They don't know how big it is. It might be an island, all right? But they have discovered this here, which of course we know today as being Brazil. So this is in a 30-year period. Portugal, in trying to reestablish itself as a center of Silk Road trade, thanks to the plague cutting off all the Crusader trade, makes them an empire. And it's the first maritime empire in world history like this, okay? It's huge. Now, you all know that this empire is going to be eclipsed by somebody else, ironically, right next door to them, called Spain. And we're going to talk about them in the next lecture. I just wanted to get you going on this. I want to make a quick point before we end this lecture, though. Portugal's right here, okay? Portugal, as it's going around Africa, is going to discover two things. One, there's lots of islands right off the coast of both Portugal and Africa that the Europeans have not even discovered yet, all right? Look, these right here, these aren't that far away. They're like 150 miles off the coastline, and the Portuguese and anybody else from Western Europe haven't really found these. Why have they not found them? Because European ships couldn't sail very far until now. And so they found these islands. Here's the thing. Some of these islands have natives on them. Some of them don't. Unfortunately, we can't learn much from the natives that were on these because the Portuguese will basically eradicate the populations here, and here. Madeira is going to be the big island, very important island for the Portuguese. What's going to happen is the Portuguese are going to start to settle these islands. And then the Portuguese are going to notice that there are African kings in Africa here who actually have slaves that they want to sell. And the Portuguese are going to start buying African slaves. Now, these are the guys that start this trend. The Portuguese are going to start buying African slaves and then depositing those African slaves upon these islands. And on these islands, the Portuguese are going to take sugar that they've brought, sugar cane plants and seeds that they've brought from India, and they're going to start planting sugar way over here. Western Europe didn't have a lot of access to sugar until this moment. Meaning, to get sugar, you had to order it from over here, and it took a long time to get to, especially with all that plague and stuff, right? And so now the Portuguese can not only go and get sugar directly from India, but the Portuguese are going to set up this cash crop of islands growing sugar using African slaves to do the labor, right? This model, started by the Portuguese, is going to be the model copied by the Spanish, by the English, by the Dutch, and more. Okay, this is the model where you actually have African slaves providing the labor for plantation work that is going to lead into that aspect of U.S. history as well. Okay, this is one of the slave plantations on Madeira. Okay, so we're going to end here, and then when we pick this up again with part 2, Age of Exploration part 2, Spain. All right, what's the deal with Spain? Why are they so different than what the Portuguese do? How do the Spanish jump into this race and then conquer half the planet? What happens here? All right, thanks a lot, folks.